Behind the triumphal arches and echoing forms of ancient Rome, a darker truth whispers from the shadows. One of beauty enslaved, of boyhood stolen, and of men turned into objects of pleasure for the whims of the empire's most powerful. When we think of the Roman Empire, images of grand architecture, military conquest, and philosophical greatness spring to mind. But beneath that marble facade, behind every golden goblet raised at a banquet, there existed a class of forgotten victims whose stories history has mostly silenced. These were not soldiers, not senators, not even common slaves. These were male concubines, boys and young men taken from conquered territories or sold into bondage by desperate families, chosen for their beauty, not their bravery, valued for their compliance, not their courage. They didn't live in chains, at least not the kind you can see. These boys were selected at slave markets and scenes that more closely resembled cattle auctions than human exchange. Wealthy Roman elites, draped in silks and scented oils, would stroll among rows of frightened teenagers, poking, prodding, bargaining. The ideal was a Greek complexion, a youthful face, a body that hinted at strength but had yet to mature. Aesthetic mattered more than soul. For some, this nightmare began as early as age 10. Once bought, their names were often erased, replaced with nicknames or pet names assigned by their new masters. Their identities dissolved. From that point on, their sole purpose was to satisfy, to obey, to perform. Their smiles were rehearsed, their laughter manufactured. Every glance had to be calculated, every movement pleasing. But make no mistake, these boys weren't lovers. They were possessions, trained, dressed, groomed, and displayed as symbols of status. To Rome's elite, a beautiful male concubine was no different than a prized stallion or imported vase. Costly, admired, but ultimately disposable, and the walls of their golden prisons were thick with silence. No laws protected them. No philosopher pondered their pain. Their stories lived and died in whispers, until now. This is a part of Roman history no textbook will teach. The part where pleasure came at the price of a person's soul. And for one boy, the central figure in our tale, this life was about to begin. He remembered the dust first, the way it clung to his toes. Then the hands, strange hands, turned his face side to side like inspecting fruit. He didn't speak Latin yet, but he understood enough to know they were choosing. The boy's name had been Nicandros, a name with history, a name whispered by a weeping mother before Roman soldiers pulled him away from his village in the Greek province of Achaia. Now, he stood in the heart of Rome's largest slave market, naked, frightened, and for sale. Buyers surrounded him. Senators' wives, aging aristocrats, wealthy widows. They weren't there for laborers. They came for delight, for status, for flesh. Each youth on the platform was ranked. They were oiled to glisten, instructed to smile, and taught just enough to answer questions about their origin. Greek? A mark of elegance. Blonde hair? Exotic. No body hair? Perfect. Nicandros was barely 13. The bidding began quickly. The auctioneer boasted about his freshness, his docility, and how well he'd adapt. No one asked what Nicandros wanted. No one cared that he trembled. He was sold to a man called Lucius Vero, a Roman of high esteem with 3 estates and a reputation for refined tastes. The price, 3,000 denarii, enough to feed a poor family for a decade. From the moment he was purchased, Nicandros ceased to be a person. He became a status symbol, an accessory draped in imported linens and perfumed oils, trained to smile at guests, to remain quiet, to always be available. He was given a tutor, yes, taught to play the lyre, to read poetry, to quote Cicero. But none of this was for his betterment. It was all part of the performance. Nicandros was to become the perfect pet, charming but obedient, graceful but silent. At night, he often cried alone in his chambers, where soft sheets and golden goblets couldn't hide the truth. He was owned. His future, his choices, even his name, were no longer his. And while his new master paraded him at parties and praised his poise, no one noticed the quiet war behind those young eyes, the war between survival and self. But Nicandros wasn't the only one. Hundreds of boys like him dotted the villas and palaces of Rome, each one dressed in silk, each one trapped in a life polished on the outside, but broken beneath the surface. The empire called it refinement. History called it progress. But Nicandros? He called it what was a beautiful cage. To guess, the state was a paradise. Marble fountains, carved gardens, and music echoing through colonnades. But behind the veils and velvet, Nicandros learned that beauty in Rome was often just a disguise. Lucius Vero's villa sat on the Palatine Hill, one of the most prestigious addresses in ancient Rome. Its halls were filled with art and music, servants and scholars. But within its inner quarters, Nicandros quickly learned the rules weren't written in stone. They were whispered, expected, and enforced through silence. His days began before dawn. Grooming, bathing, preparation. His appearance was curated daily like a museum exhibit. He was to be immaculate, not just clean, radiant, not just polite, enchanting. A team of servants assisted him. Tutors drilled him on the philosophies of Seneca. A music instructor rehearsed endless verses of poetry. A chamberlain corrected his posture and gestures. Every detail mattered. Because he wasn't being raised, he was being staged. At public feasts, Nicandros would stand silently behind his master's couch, his youthful presence both decorative and symbolic. The other guests would nod approvingly, complimenting Lucius on his good taste. Nicandros was taught to respond with a soft smile, a bowed head, and a rehearsed phrase, always in Latin, never in Greek. But what others saw as charm was, to Nicandros, a performance in chains. Lucius was not outwardly cruel. He gave expensive gifts, offered gentle instruction, and at times even praised Nicandros in front of others. But this made things worse, not better, because with each reward came a reminder, all of it could be taken away. If Nicandros frowned too long, hesitated with an answer, or failed to please in some imperceptible way, a gift might be revoked. His lessons paused, his freedoms restricted, a day of music replaced by one of isolation. Worse still were the other concubines. Yes, there were others. Not many. Just 2 others in the household. Both older. Both already molded into the roles that Nicandros was just beginning to understand. But instead of camaraderie, there was competition. Lucius ensured it. He'd praise one in front of the others, offer a gold ring to one and nothing to the next. Each gesture sowed tension. Nicandros found himself smiling through jealousy, thanking through fear, and learning to hide his feelings with frightening ease. The villa became a mirror, every wall reflecting back the version of himself Lucius wanted. Over time, Nicandros forgot how his voice sounded when he wasn't performing. In secret, he scratched a word into the wooden beam above his sleeping mat, a word in Greek. Epsilon lambda epsilon upsilon theta epsilon rho alpha, freedom. He stared at it each night before sleep, wondering what that word could possibly mean for someone like him. Because here in Rome, beauty could be a blessing or a sentence. From the outside, Nicandros lived a life others envied. Fine garments, music, and education. But what value is elegance if it's built on erasure? As the years passed, Nicandros matured, in silence, in service, and in sorrow. At 16, he became exactly what Lucius Vero desired. Articulate, graceful, obedient, and admired. Guests now greeted him by name. Poets referenced his smile in their verses. Even visiting senators marveled at how refined he had become. But Nicandros knew better. His refinement had not been nurtured. It had been engineered. He could recite Virgil, yes, but he could not speak of his childhood. He could name every consolation in Latin, but not describe the scent of his mother's cooking. His old life, his language, his identity, all had been scrubbed away to make room for his role. He was still possession. Only now, he was a polished one. Lucius often brought him on journeys to his country estates or coastal retreats. Travel, to others, was a luxury. But to Nicandros, it was just a new stage for the same performance. He never chose a destination. He never knew how long they'd stay. He was simply expected to adapt, to charm new guests, to blend into unfamiliar settings, and always to maintain that perfect mask. And though he was surrounded by opulence, Nicandros had nothing of his own. No family, no coin, no rights. Even his friendships were fragile. If another slave grew too close, Lucius would reassign them. If Nicandros laughed too freely, it might be seen as rebellion. So He learned to guard his emotions, not just from others, but from himself. And yet, there were moments when he looked out at the sea during a villa trip to Campania, and remembered that there was once a world beyond Rome. Or when he overheard merchants speaking Greek in the market, and felt something awaken, a flicker of before. In these moments, he felt not free, but awake. And it scared him, because for someone in Nicandros' position, hope could be dangerous. It was a flame that, if left burning too long, might consume everything. Lucius, for all his calculated kindness, reminded him often, in words, in tone, in glances, that he was fortunate, that others had it worse, that obedience was rewarded. And Nicandros, trained to survive, always smiled and nodded. But deep within, he began to wonder, if this gilded life was truly a gift, why did it feel like a sentence? In a world that demanded obedience, even a passing thought of resistance was a revolution. And Nicandros had started thinking a lot. By now, Nicandros had spent nearly 5 years inside Lucius Verro's world, a curated existence dressed in silk and painted smiles. But under the surface, a quiet rebellion had begun to take shape. It didn't start with grand gestures or shouted defiance. It started with small things, a pause before obeying, a glance held a second too long, a question asked that wasn't supposed to be asked. One morning after a feast, Nicandros noticed a new servant, a boy from Hispania, newly purchased, not yet trained to perform the role. The boy still cried at night, still flinched when summoned, still whispered prayers in a language no one understood. Nicandros saw himself in him, not just who he had been, but what he had become. That night, he crept into the garden and spoke to the boy in hushed tones. Not commands, not instructions, but comfort. He told the boy to keep a piece of himself hidden. Don't let them take all of you, he whispered. Even if you have to act, don't forget who you are when no one's looking. For the first time, Nicandros had broken a rule. Not one written in law, but one carved deep into the social code of Rome. Never encourage awareness. Never feed resistance. And yet, he felt alive. In the days that followed, Lucius seemed colder, less patient, less trusting. Had someone told him? Or had Nicandros' mask simply slipped enough to show the thought behind it? He didn't know. But he did know this. He couldn't go back to unthinking obedience. One afternoon, while being prepared for a banquet, he refused a cosmetic treatment, a simple thing, a scented oil applied to his face. He shook his head, softly but firmly. The room went silent. The servant hesitated. The chamberlain stepped in. Nicandros repeated, "Not today." The punishment came not with violence, but with erasure. He was removed from the guest list that night, sent to his quarters early. The next day, he was given no lessons, no instruments, no books, only silence. But Nicandros had learned that silence could be survived. In fact, it had been a companion for years. He used that time to think, to remember his father's face, his mother's hands, the songs of his childhood, the way the sun used to feel when he ran barefoot through open fields, not polished stone. And slowly, he began collecting memories like armor, not to fight with, but to protect the last piece of himself that Lucius hadn't reached. When the day finally came, the day Nicandros was no longer useful. There were no speeches, no farewells, just a quiet dismissal, not even goodbye. In Rome, beauty aged, and when it did, it vanished. At 18, Nicandros was no longer the wide-eyed boy who arrived from Achaia. His features were sharper, his voice deeper. And in the eyes of men like Lucius Verro, the magic had worn off. There was no dramatic betrayal, no scene, just a slow retreat of attention. His lessons stopped. His appearances at gatherings became rare. And eventually, he was informed that he would be transferred to a lesser household in the countryside. He was no longer property of prestige, just property. The villa gates closed behind him without fanfare. No carriage waited for him this time. Just a cart. No silks. No perfume. Just silence. What became of Nicandros in that rural estate is unclear. Like so many concubines of ancient Rome, his story fades from record. He may have lived out his days in quiet labor. He may have run. He may have died. We'll never know, because history rarely keeps the names of the forgotten. But Nicandros' story, though fictional, is a composite of many, of thousands of young men lost to a system that celebrated power and silenced pain, a system that paraded refinement while erasing humanity. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Rome did not see what it was doing as wrong. To them, it was beauty, culture, sophistication. But beneath it all were boys like Nicandros, bought, trained, displayed, and discarded. Their names were not etched in stone. Their voices were not preserved in scrolls. But their suffering, it echoes if you listen close enough. So, as we marvel at ancient columns and recite Latin phrases, we must also remember the human cost of empire. Because for every triumph Rome celebrated, there were lives it chose to forget. Let Nicandros stand for all of them, a reminder that even in the most gilded chapters of history, there are pages soaked in silence,